My name is Manjit Misra. It's an all-American name. I serve as the director of the Seed Science Center here at Iowa State University, also the director of the Institute for Biosafety. Today, we are going to have an excellent discussion, and 6 p.m., as you know, is the dinner time, but instead of eating food, we will talk about food. The speaker today is Dr. Greg Jaffe, and Greg is the director of the Biotechnology Project at the Center for Science in the Public Interest, CSPI. You see that on the screen there. This is an advocacy and educational organization that focuses on nutrition, health, food safety, and sound science. Greg came to CSPI in 2001 after a long and distinguished career in government service. He first worked as a trial attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice, Environmental and Natural Resources Division, and then moved to become the senior counsel with the U.S. EPA. Greg has been involved in not only domestic work, but a lot of international work, such as in Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, Malawi, South Africa, and Indonesia. In fact, he is going to give another talk at the Seed Science Center tomorrow at 11:30 on some of the work that he is doing in Africa, and I'd like to invite you, if you are able to come, to listen to that talk as well. Currently, he is serving in the advisory committee for the what they call ACT, which is the committee formed by the Secretary of Agriculture to look at the various visionary ways we can use agriculture for, improving the food security and fuel security and so on. He is also an advisory council member for the Biosafety Institute at Iowa State University. Greg is going to talk about genetically engineered foods, the naked truth. Help me to welcome Dr. Greg Jaffe.
Thank you very much, Manjit, and I thank the Seed Center and Iowa State University for inviting me here today. It's always great to come out to university and speak to such a large audience. I appreciate everybody postponing their dinner to talk about genetically engineered foods today. Genetically engineered foods are a topic near and dear to my heart. It's a fairly controversial topic, controversial in the United States and throughout the world. There are proponents of this technology who feel very strongly about it. There are opponents of the technology who also feel very strongly about it. And there's lots of rhetoric, there's lots of misinformation, there's lots of facts out there. What I hope to do in the next 40 or 45 minutes is to cut through that and give you the naked truth. What I think are really the facts out there about this technology, both the positive and the negative, and discuss a few of the issues around it. I hope to leave time for some questions and discussion and comments. That's always fun for me to also hear what other people's points of view are, and to do that. So I hope that people will stay around and do that. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to first give you a little background about CSPI and our biotechnology project, so you know the lens or the perspective that I come at this topic from. Then I'll talk a little bit about what are genetically engineered foods and their current status, so we all have the same baseline. Then I'll get into issues about benefits, risks, and regulation of these crops. I'll look a little bit at the international perspective, what's happening outside the United States, talk about some of the future applications that may be coming down the pipeline, and then talk about one issue that's very hot these days, especially in Washington, in this committee that Manjit mentioned about coexistence. How does biotech agriculture get along with organic and non-biotech agriculture? And then I'll end with some conclusions. So as Manjit said, I work for the Center for Science in the Public Interest. It's a food and nutrition consumer organization. We've been around for 40 years now. We're started by 3 scientists who wanted to bring scientific science into the policy arena on behalf of consumers. So we're a consumer organization. We're a nonprofit. We publish a Nutrition Action Health newsletter, and we have about 900,000 subscribers in the U.S. and Canada for that newsletter. It comes out 10 times a year. And I mention that because we take no government or industry funding, and we never have in the 40 years of our existence. And that was very important to the executive director and the founders, because they wanted us not to have a conflict of interest or even a perception of a conflict of interest. So where do we get our funding? We get it from those member subscribers. Individuals like yourself subscribe to our newsletter. They pay $10 or $20 for that annual subscription, and we ask for donations, and some people give us $10 and some people give us $1,000. And that's primarily what runs our organization. We do get about 10% of our funding from independent philanthropic foundations, but we don't take funding from foundations that are directly linked to a corporation. And that's how we keep our independence, we believe. And therefore, what we do is we advocate and educate based on the best available science out there on behalf of consumers. We lobby Congress. We are a watchdog of the federal government. We're a watchdog of the industry. But we also try to provide information about the relationship between diet, health, and nutrition to the average citizens out there in the United States and in Canada. The Biotech Project was started about 10 years ago when I came there. And the reason it was started was my boss felt that there was a lot of rhetoric around this topic, and there wasn't somebody who had looked at the facts and was trying to provide facts to consumers, not trying to sway them one way or the other on all of this. And so we looked at the science out there at the time, and we looked at the current crops in the U.S., and we based on the facts and the science there, we said that they were safe to eat, and that to our members, our subscribers, we said that there were some benefits from those crops, and I'll get into some of that later. We did say that those products needed to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. So you couldn't say that just because one crop is safe now that the next one is going to be safe. And that we pushed for biosafety regulatory systems that really work to ensure that there are safe products out there that are marketed, and that if there are unsafe products, they're not marketed. I am a lawyer by background, so I spend a lot of time on those regulatory issues, and I'll mention a few of those in my talk. So I want to make sure that we're all on the same page when we're talking about a genetically engineered food. And so what does creating a genetic organism mean? What it really is genetic engineering is a technique in the laboratory that allows scientists to move a beneficial trait from one organism to another in a very precise way. They find a gene of interest, they insert that gene into a plant or an animal cell, that DNA, then they select for that cell with the insertion in it, and then they breed the plant or animal normally. And it's hereditary, it becomes part of the DNA. You'll hear lots of terms for this. Some people call them genetically engineered organisms, some people call them genetically modified organisms. In the international context, some of them call them living modified organisms. They really all mean sort of the same thing. And here's a schematic of exactly that, what I was just telling you. So this is a real example of a genetically engineered crop that's out there. There's a bacterial organism called Bacillus thuringiensis out there, and scientists found that there's some DNA from that bacteria that has a gene, and that gene makes a protein, in this case a toxin, that kills certain pests. And so they extract that DNA out of that gene from that DNA, from that bacteria, and then they take a gene gun and they take that and then shoot it into a corn cell in a petri dish, and the DNA gets inserted into that corn cell, and then they grow those plants, and all the progeny of that into a corn cell have that DNA in each of the cells, in each of the genes. It's expressed in the leaves, and then a pest comes along, eats the leaves, and dies. And so we call that a genetic engineered crop, in this case a BT crop, because it has a gene from the Bacillus thuringiensis microorganism. And in this case, it produces a pesticide in the crop that kills the pest. And this is a real example that we'll keep coming back to. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about a genetic engineered crop, and then the food is what's made from that crop. So, as I said, this development process really involves starting in the laboratory at the DNA level to find a gene of interest, a trait, some beneficial trait, introducing that into the cell. Then eventually it's grown in a greenhouse to decide to see if it works, if it's efficacious, if it's beneficial. Eventually it would be grown in a field trial out in the outdoors, because we know that just because something works in the laboratory or in the greenhouse may or may not work under real life conditions. And eventually you would get it commercially released, so it's grown by farmers and then used in the food supply. So that is the developmental process that we're talking about here. So, are there any genetic engineered crops out there? And yes, there are. And they're grown in all of these countries that are in green here on this chart. This is not my data, but it's the data that everybody uses around the world. And you can see crops are mainly grown primarily in North America and South America, although they're beginning to be grown more in Asia. So what is the current status of genetically engineered crops? Well, they're grown in over 29 countries around the world by over 15 million farmers. Total acreage last year was 365 million acres. In terms of the largest acreage, it's the United States. They're growing 165 million acres, and I'm sure if any of you have driven around Iowa, most of the corn and soybeans that you drive through is genetically engineered, and we'll get to that in a minute. In terms of the largest, in terms of farmers, though, it's India and China. They have almost 13 million farmers growing these crops, primarily small-scale farmers, and I'll come back to them a little later in the presentation. The types of products in the U.S. that are genetically engineered, the types of crops, corn, as I mentioned, soybeans, cotton, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa, some squash, and some papaya. So those are the current crops that are genetically engineered that are grown in the United States. And as I mentioned, the reason you do this is for some beneficial trait. And so what are the traits out there in the United States? Well, as I mentioned, there's these crops that have these built-in pesticides. That was the example I gave of the BT there that has a built-in pesticide. There are also some crops that have been engineered to be resistant to an herbicide. So in this case, they don't produce the herbicide. What they do is you can spray the herbicide over the crop, and the crop doesn't die, but the weeds around it die. And there are also some crops out there, specifically the squash and papaya that I mentioned, that are resistant to viruses. So plants have viruses just like animals or humans. They cause the plant not to produce as well and the fruit not to look as well. And so some of those are resistant to viruses, almost sort of like having a vaccine, but it's DNA introduced into them. So those are the kinds of crops that are out there. In terms of how much is out there, I just put a few of the major crops in the U.S. and the percentage of those crops that are genetically engineered. So this past year, and some of this is 2011 data, 88% of all the corn that was grown in the United States was genetically engineered. So that's why I can say that most of the corn that you probably drove through in Iowa, a lot of it was genetically engineered. 90% of the cotton that we grow in the U.S., 94% of the soybeans, and 95% of the sugar beets. So in a few of these crops, you have very high adoption, meaning a lot of it is grown that's been genetically engineered with an addition of a specific gene that produces a protein that has a trait that's important. And so what are these crops used for? I put this in my presentation a lot because I think people don't really have an understanding a lot around the country about what these genetically engineered crops are used for. And to some extent, they're used for something no different than these crops were used for before they were genetically engineered. Most of the corn and soybeans that are grown in the United States, the first use of that is for animal feed. And so most of this that's genetically engineered is field corn and sort of commodity soybeans that are used for animal feed. They're also used for industrial purposes. I'm sure I'm preaching to an audience that knows all about corn for ethanol when I'm out in Iowa here, but obviously a lot of it is used for that. It does go into the human food supply, though. It primarily does that as in processed ingredients. So the sugar beets would be turned into sugar. The corn would be turned into corn oil or high fructose corn syrup. The cotton would go into cottonseed oil that might go into food. The soybeans would go into things like soybean oil or soy lecithin. So those are the kinds of ways that most of these crops interact with the food supply and things that Americans might be eating. The cotton, of course, goes into clothing. And then there are a small amount of these that are eaten as whole foods. So there is some sweet corn that's genetically engineered out there. Most of the corn in the U.S., I think 99% of it plus is field corn. But there is sweet corn that's grown in the U.S. and there is a small percentage, probably 5 or 10% of the sweet corn. Sweet corn is probably 1 million acres or something in the U.S. 5 or 10% of that is genetically engineered. And as I mentioned, there's some green and yellow squash that's engineered, as well as some papayas in Hawaii that are engineered. But that's the only foods that I'm aware of that are whole foods that you'd be eating directly. Everything else you'd be eating from a genetically engineered crop would be a highly processed ingredient, so an ingredient that's in a food. My organization might say that some of those ingredients are in the food too, more than we'd like them to be. High fructose corn syrup is found everywhere in our diet, and we would say that's probably not a good thing, but independent of whether that high fructose corn syrup was genetically engineered or not. But before I move on to some of the more details about genetically engineered crops and foods, I just wanted to put this technology or this technique that's used both on this campus as well as other academic universities around the world, country in context. And the context is that, humans and scientists have really been manipulating crops for decades and centuries to try to have varieties that are beneficial to farmers that would increase yields and produce better crops for humans to eat. And so I just wanted to put up here a number of the other methods that are used by scientists, both some of them in laboratories, some of them outside laboratories, to improve crop varieties and animal varieties that we use in our agriculture. All of these are used here, I'm sure, at Iowa State University. There are academics and scientists who are using all of these. And all of these have been used over the years. And to some extent, genetic engineering is another one of these techniques on a continuum. And I think I mention that because I think there's some misunderstanding sometimes out there that I always hear the comment that, well, genetic engineering, you're taking a gene from one species and you're putting it into another species. That never would happen in nature. That bacteria never would mate and transfer its DNA to a corn plant. And the answer to that is yes. There's no question that bacterium would never transfer its DNA or its gene to a corn plant. And so to that extent, it is crossing species barriers. But at the same time, scientists have been doing a lot of other things to our food supply that also don't happen in nature and wouldn't happen but for that human intervention. And I give the example of using radiation to create mutant varieties of plants. So for about 40 years now, scientists have been using X-rays and gamma rays and bombarding plant cells to cause mutations in DNA and then looking for a mutation that is a beneficial trait, and then end up growing up and producing that variety. And there's a database. The Atomic Energy Commission keeps a database of all of the varieties out there that have been commercialized using this method. And I just put a few of the crops down there that have been grown and eaten in the United States. So there's a wheat variety that was produced through irradiation that Americans have been eating for a couple decades. A lot of the pink grapefruit varieties came from one of the pink grapefruit varieties came from irradiation. There's a rice variety that was grown in California in the 90s that came from irradiation, and peppermint. And so I raise that not to scare people about all these other methods that farmers use, the scientists use, but to put it in context that there are a lot of things that we do to the crops and animals that we use in our agricultural system to try to improve those varieties, to try to make them our farms more efficient, our food taste better, our food be more nutritious. So with that background, we have these genetically engineered crops. They're out there. They're being grown. Why are they being grown? They wouldn't be grown, and especially in those large numbers, if there weren't some benefits out there. And one of the points I hope you'll take home from this talk today is when you're talking about this technology and these specific crops, you need to look at everything on a case-by-case basis. One of the things that the proponents and opponents do all the time in this debate is make generalizations. Biotech crops are going to save the world. They're going to, stop food insecurity, or they're all beneficial. They're going to help the environment, help farmers. And the data out there suggests that you really have to look at each of those crops on a case-by-case basis. And it really depends on the agricultural system that you're talking about. It depends on the receiving environment. It depends on the specific trait. And I'm going to keep coming back to that idea of case by case because I think that's important here. So what are some of the benefits of the current genetically engineered crops? Well, there are some benefits to farmers from some of these crops. There are some benefits to the environment from some of them. To date, I don't find any ones that have any direct benefits to consumers. We don't have a tastier melon out there yet, or a more nutritious tomato or something out there yet. But consumers are also farmers. Consumers also care about the environment. So there are clearly indirect benefits to consumers out there. I'm not going to go through each crop. I don't have time, and what the benefits are for each of those. I listed some of the different benefits that exist for some of these crops, and I just want to give one example to show you my case-by-case, the reasoning behind the fact that I think it's important to look at these case-by-case. And the one I'm going to give you an example is BT cotton. So I mentioned Bacillus thuringiensis, and the cotton's been engineered. So there's cotton that's been engineered in the United States to produce a toxin that's a pesticide in cotton. In the United States, cotton's grown not so much up here, more down in the southern parts of the country. Cotton uses a lot of pesticides. There are many, many multiple sprays of pesticides, and they're not the most environmentally benign pesticides. Farmers in the United States have adopted this BT cotton in very large numbers, and the data out there from both academics, people at universities like independent academics at universities like Iowa State and others, have found that there is a significant reduction in pesticide use for those crops. So that's the benefit in particular there. They don't see necessarily an increase in yield. Farmers, if they didn't have this, they would be spraying that chemical pesticide, and therefore we also see the benefits from spraying less pesticide. There may be more birds in the field, other types of things like that. So that's one benefit from one specific crop. Now that same exact trait, BT cotton, is also grown in China, and a lot of small-scale farmers grow that in China. Now in China, a lot of farmers also used pesticides. Some of the farmers in China used pesticides, but they didn't necessarily have the same regulations about how to use those pesticides. And so I don't think it was necessarily anticipated when this specific trait and variety was introduced into China. But what they've documented as one of the big benefits here has been a reduction in farmer poisonings, in farm worker poisonings, because in fact they're not spraying pesticides as much there. And the pesticides there, that when they were sprayed, the farm workers didn't have the same protections that they have here in the United States. So in this case, a different benefit, the same product in a very different receiving environment, a very different agricultural system. Same product, let's look at South Africa. Small-scale farmers have used BT cotton in South Africa. Now in South Africa, farmers didn't have the money for the pesticides. So before BT cotton, they just took a yield loss. So they had much reduced yield because when there was bad pest pressure, those farmers they decimated the crop. BT cotton comes along and you see very large increases in yields. The data that the academics have found is large increases in yields there. So again, same product, different agricultural system, different receiving environment, very different benefit. So I mentioned that just as one example. I don't have time to go through all of the different crops out there, but I mentioned that because you have to really you just, again, can't make generalizations here. You really have to look at a specific product, a specific crop in a specific environment. So if there were only benefits and no risks, I guess I could go home. I wouldn't have a job, and maybe there wouldn't be all this controversy around it. But there are some potential risks here. As I mentioned before, we are taking a gene and a protein from an organism, maybe an organism that we haven't eaten, maybe that hasn't been in our diet, and we're introducing it to something that we do eat in our diet. And the question is that going to be harmful in any way? And again, just like the benefits, you've got to look at each one of these case by case. You cannot make generalizations. Just because one is safe may or may not mean the next one is. But what are the potential food safety risks from genetically engineered foods? Well, as I mentioned, in this case, we're taking a gene that produces a protein and we're introducing it into corn or canola or soybeans, whatever you want to say. Well, we know that proteins sometimes can cause allergic reactions. And the question here is whether this new protein is in some way going to be an allergen or have an allergenicity to it. Similarly, we know that proteins can sometimes be toxic, and so one of the concerns is to make sure that it's not a toxin, that it's not going to have any toxic properties if people eat it. So those are two of the biggest risks that one needs to check before one commercializes these products. There are also issues about unintended effects. All the crops that we grow today, a lot of them have harmful substances in them. A lot of times we bred them to reduce those harmful substances. Sometimes they're grown in parts of the plant that aren't edible. We want to make sure when we're introducing this DNA in a random fashion into the genome of this crop that we're not in some way changing that balance, that we're somehow not now causing the plant to produce something at a higher level that it didn't produce before that was fine at a lower level, but now if we're eating it at a higher level might be problematic. And similarly, we do eat food for nutrition. We eat it for subsistence, and we want to make sure that in no way are we changing that. We don't want to all of a sudden be eating corn or soybeans or something like that and not get the nutritional value that we got out of it. So those are all potential food safety risks that need to at least be looked at in this technology. There's also potential environmental risks. Again, got to look at it case by case. But as I mentioned, some of these crops produce a pesticide. What's the purpose of a pesticide? to kill a pest. Well, we want to make sure that it doesn't kill non-targets, beneficial or insects that are in the field, birds that might come and eat that corn, deer that might go through that field. So we want to make sure there's no harm to what we call non-targets. We want to make sure that there's no impacts on biological diversity. And then we also want to make sure that we don't develop resistant insects or resistant weeds. We've always been on a treadmill in our agriculture where we've used chemical pesticides, and over time we develop resistance to them, and we have to move on to the next level of chemical. We want to make sure that doesn't happen here. And then, of course, there are socioeconomic and ethical concerns anytime you're dealing with new technologies. Again, you've got to look at this case by case, but there are clear impacts on international trade. There's the issue of reliance on multinational corporations for the seeds. These are patented genes, so there's intellectual property issues. And there are effects on other farmers, such as organic farmers, and I'm going to come to that later in the talk. The question for all of these I always want to raise is, where is the line between issues specific to genetic engineering versus concerns not unique to this technology? We do have reliance on multinational corporations for seeds a lot, independent of whether they were biotech or not, for example, and we still have trade issues a lot because of that. So it's something to keep in mind when you think about this and when you see discussions about it. So I want to turn my attention to the regulatory system. I've talked about some of the benefits of this technology. I've talked about some of the potential risks. So, that's one of the reasons you have a regulatory system, is to ensure that, one, make sure that the products that are out there have the benefits and don't have those risks. And the U.S. government does regulate these crops before they're introduced into the commercial stream for farmers to grow. And there are three agencies that really work on that. There's the U.S. Department of Agriculture, there's the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Food and Drug Administration. I'm going to try not to give too many acronyms. Those of us in Washington, we live by all the different acronyms. So at USDA, they regulate genetic engineered crops under the Plant Protection Act. And that's primarily concerned with plant pest risks, agricultural risks, to make sure that things don't harm our agriculture. And they address releases of these crops into the environment. They issue field trial permits when you're doing those confined field trials that I talked about, and then eventually they deregulate a safe crop. They say that it doesn't need to be regulated anymore. And to date, they've issued permits for over 25,000 field trials over the last 15 years, and probably deregulated over 80 crops out there. FDA is in charge of our food, making sure our food is safe, or most of our food is safe. USDA regulates some food, but I'm not going to get into that here. But FDA is in charge of regulating crops, for example, fruits and vegetables and things. And they regulate under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which was, I think, first passed in 1906, well before we had genetic engineering or anything close to genetic engineering. And pretty much in our food supply, the only thing that gets a pre-market mandatory approval is food additives, things like saccharin or aspartame, those type of things. Most other foods are introduced into our food supply as generally recognized as safe. And FDA looked at biotech crops back in 1992 and made a scientific and policy decision that they weren't going to consider genetic engineered crops, the new DNA and the protein, to be a food additive, but instead to be generally recognized as safe. And some of their analysis was, well, we've been eating DNA for a long time, so introducing DNA isn't going to, we can eat DNA, and then we've eaten some proteins. But they did set up a voluntary consultation process where they said, well, we do want the companies to sort of voluntarily ensure that that the corn with the new gene is substantially equivalent to the corn without the gene. And to date, all the companies have complied with that, as far as we know. EPA regulates pesticides under FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act. And since these plants produce a pesticide, they regulate those crops. And they do both an environmental and a food safety component before they register that for to be used. I spend a lot of my time sort of criticizing parts of that regulatory system. I think it could be improved. I think there are improvements in all three of those agencies. I'm going to give you just one example because I don't have the time to go into all of them. But I did write this article last year, and it's up on my website, which I'll give you at the end, and it's freely available, and you're welcome to download it and read it if you want. I'm going to talk about FDA because I come from a food and nutrition organization, and I think food safety is critical for consumers. Consumers want to know if they go to the store and they buy something that it's safe to eat. And our view is that this voluntary consultation process just isn't sufficient. The decision you get from FDA is a statement that they don't have any questions at this time about the safety of the food, but it's up to the developer, maybe Monsanto, DuPont, or whatever, to make sure its food is safe. And my view is that FDA should be have a say in this. They should be telling us that they're safe to eat. Other countries do that. Genetic engineered crops that are grown in all those other countries I told you about, they're not grown and eaten until their equivalent of FDA says it's safe. And I think it's sort of ironic that in the United States you can't plant a genetically engineered crop without getting a permit, without USDA approving it, but we can somehow eat these without FDA affirmatively saying it's approved. So I've said that they've argued for many, many years unsuccessfully, but I continue to argue it that we do need a mandatory pre-market approval process. I've worked with Senator Durbin's staff from Illinois, a neighboring state here, to set up such a process at FDA. It needs amendment to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, but it hasn't passed to date. The industry has not been in favor of that, and they've also been other food safety issues on Congress's plate. So, as I said, there are other criticisms I have of the regulatory system, but I do think it's very important we do regulate these crops, that we do ensure they're safe. But I do, as I've also said, there are also a lot of crops that have gone through that system that I think are safe out there. So what's happening internationally on this topic? As I mentioned earlier, there are 29 countries around the world that are growing these crops. It's a lot of developed countries. I'm going to focus a little bit on what's happening in developing countries because that's interesting. And as Manjeet mentioned, I spend a fair amount of my time in Africa and developing countries helping them understand the regulatory systems, establish regulatory systems, and be able to determine for themselves whether these crops are safe and whether they're beneficial and whether they want to use them. So I think two of the big movers and shakers in this area are China and India. That's probably nothing new. They're big movers and shakers in lots of different things. But China has already commercialized, as I mentioned before, BT cotton. They have some BT poplars. They have some virus-resistant papaya and sweet pepper that they're growing. India has BT cotton. And as I mentioned, almost 13 million farmers in China and India in 2010 grew these crops. One of the interesting things about this technology is that it's sort of scale neutral. Since it's in the seed, it can help a farmer who's growing a half an acre or 1 acre as well as a farmer who has 200 or 2,000 acres. But China and India are spending a lot of money, especially China, putting in research, public sector research into this technology. They've been working on genetically engineered rice for a long time now, and that may be commercialized soon, and I think it's a big crop in Asia. If they do that I think would be a game changer, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And BT eggplant is something that's been going through the regulatory system in India for quite a while now, and if that eggplant is a big crop in India, it's a staple food in India, and that also would be a very big step if that was approved. In Africa, there are just 3 countries that grow these crops. South Africa grows some maize, soybeans, and cotton. Burkina Faso grows cotton, and Egypt grows maize. They are clearly sort of just at the infancy of this. But as I said, I spent some time there, so I thought it's interesting to put up some of the crops that are currently going through some field trials in different countries and are being developed. What's interesting about this is, to date, most of those countries and most of the crops you've seen, with the exception of China, are really crops that were developed in the United States, and the genes were found here, and then they've been adopted and adapted to local varieties in other countries. What we're seeing in Africa for the first time is staple crops in Africa getting this technology being used. A lot of that's through public-private partnerships and public foundations like the Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation and others who are doing it. So you see things like cowpea or cassava, bananas, sorghum. These are crops that are staple crops to millions of farmers in Africa and may or may not have a benefit to them growing some of these. So it's a little different, and so these countries are exploring it, but they're now exploring it on their terms, different from exploring it sort of on our terms, meaning taking the farmers in South Africa who are growing corn and soybeans are really large-scale farmers who are growing a lot of the same crops that we're growing in the U.S. So what do I see coming along in the future in this technology? Well, in the U.S., I think you're going to see, and the most immediately, is more of the same. Most of the crops to date have really benefited the farmer. They've helped the farmer reduce their costs or increase their income in some ways. I'm not saying that that's bad. I'm just saying that's a fact of what it's been. I think you'll see a lot more of that. That's what makes the biotech companies, the private companies that are producing these, money, and that's their customer, the farmers. But you also will begin to see some stress tolerance crops, so some crops like drought tolerant corn or salt tolerant soybeans or something like that, where they're going to try to help in situations where soil conditions and agricultural conditions are less than perfect. And some of those will both have some developed country but also some developing country applications potentially. There are several nutritionally enhanced crops in the works. I think Monsanto has an omega-3 soybean that's going to, or it's omega-3 corn or soybeans that would produce a plant-based omega-3, but it's not approved yet. They also have a high oleic soybean that would produce an oil that would be almost trans fat free. My organization, as an organization that really is wanting to improve the diet, is looking forward to having those, but we haven't seen those to date to some extent because they're harder to do. The science behind them and the technical aspects behind them are harder. So we haven't seen the data yet to know whether how much omega-3 is really in that, and does it make a difference in the diet if it's put in oils and things like that. It's not just whether it's expressed, but then how does it carry through to an impact. And then I think we'll see crops grown primarily for human consumption. As I said, most of what has been grown to date is animal feed, industrial purposes. But if we start seeing things like wheat or rice, eggplant, those are things that don't really have an animal side. They're really for human consumption. I think some of these things will arrive in the next 2 to 10 years. The industry's been telling us for years about some of these. It always takes longer than they say. The other thing we're going to see is genetically engineered animals. So the first genetically engineered animal, there aren't any genetically engineered food animals to date that have been approved, is probably the transgenic salmon. This is a salmon that grows in half, well, the company claims grows in half the time. So it gets to normal size in 18 months instead of 36 months. It has a gene that produces the growth hormone all year round in the salmon, as opposed to the normal life cycle of the salmon is it grows during the summer months and then doesn't grow during the winter months. This has been in front of FDA for years. I was on the science advisory panel as the consumer representative about a year ago when it was reviewed by that science advisory panel, and they provided comments on both the environmental and the food safety issues around it, and it hasn't seen the light of day since then, so we don't know where it is, but I would anticipate it would be approved in the next 12 months, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. There's also the EnviroPig out there that causes less phosphorus pollution in its waste. People who are in the hog farms would understand that this is a benefit. That's also in the works. Genetic engineers animals, I think, are going to raise a host of different issues that aren't necessarily raised by genetic engineered crops. The regulation of those is going to be more difficult, especially some of the environmental issues. It's harder to contain animals than it is to contain crops, especially things like fish. And there's also going to be consumer acceptance issues, non-scientific concerns. There's emotion. People feel differently about animals than they feel about crops. And so I think that that's something, and they think it's odd that if you're genetic engineering animals, then are we moving to genetic engineering humans? Whether or not we can do that or not is immaterial. It's something that people think about. So I think that these are going to be more controversial as they move forward. The other thing that is happening in genetic engineering is that there are some plants and animals producing pharmaceuticals and industrial compounds. So this is sort of treating the plant or animal as a factory, introducing a gene that produces a useful product, and then extracting it from the plant cell or from the animal, and then using that, might be a vaccine or it might be an enzyme. This is happening already today. There's safflower, genetically engineered to produce human proinsulin out there. And there's the first genetic engineered animal that was approved was a goat, the genetic engineered goat. And it's the atrin goat because it produces a biologic called atrin, which is an anticoagulant. And there are 200 goats in a facility outside of Boston that they introduced this human gene into the goat. It's produced in the milk of the goat. The goats are milked, and this anticoagulant this biologic is extracted out of the milk, put into vials, purified, used in hospitals for patients going through surgery who need this, and then the goats are discarded, the milk is discarded up there. So it's an example. It's not used a lot, but the issue that's raised by this is, we want to make sure these things don't get in our food supply if we're using plants or animals in that way, and how do we ensure that? So that gets me to my sort of last topic, which is that genetic engineering, while having some benefits, having some potential risks, does make things more complicated. And it especially makes things more complicated because to some extent it's invisible. If you drive along the highway and you see the corn plants, you can't tell if they're genetically engineered or not. They look the same. You have to, the only way you can tell it is at the biological level, at the DNA level, at the protein level, with a chemical analysis. And that leads to some complications. And one of the hot topics these days is the issue of coexistence. And the idea behind this is, can different production methods get along? We have people who are growing genetic engineered crops. We have farmers who are growing non-genetic engineered conventional crops. We have farmers who are growing organic crops. And can they all get along and make sure that they don't have an economic impact on each other? Can there be seeds? Can there be a seed supply that for all those different farmers who want to produce different things? And they're doing this because they have different markets. There are some people who want different things in their markets. And the big issue is this concern about adventitious presence, which means the unintended introduction of something that you don't want. So in this case, for a lot of organic farmers, it's the unintended presence of a genetically engineered pollen that leads to genetically engineered kernels of corn. Again, they're invisible to the naked eye, but they're adventitious. They're unintended, but they're in where they're not supposed to be. This, as I said, is a very hot topic. Here was an article in the Washington Post about it last year. This one claiming that genetic engineered altered crops got a leg up on organics. And in fact, this issue of economic impact of biotech crops made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. For genetically engineered alfalfa, the decision to allow commercial production of genetically engineered alfalfa was challenged in court. There were a host of different cases that eventually made it up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court didn't opine on the coexistence issue, but they did. But that case was about the issue of what would the impact be if growing genetic engineered alfalfa to organic and to non-genetic engineered farmers and their potential international or national markets. So, for those of you who are not familiar, organic is a food production method that's specifically defined by certain rules in the United States. Something that's certified organic it's a process-based certification, but in the definition of organic, one thing that's excluded is genetically engineered inputs. So you cannot use genetically engineered seeds if you want to have an organic product. That's in the definition. The definition of organic is based on a host of different things. It's not necessarily a science-based. It's a holistic view of what people wanted to call organic based on historical and other things. And so many people that think that organic and biotech are considered by many not to be compatible. I want you to think about that a little harder. There's a great book out there called Tomorrow's Table, written by two people at UC Davis. Pamela Ronald is a plant biologist out there, and she's done genetic engineering with rice. And Raul Adamczyk, which is her husband, he runs the Sustainable Organic Farm at UC Davis. And they wrote a book that sort of said, hey, and I'm sort of paraphrasing, but they sort of said, what should our goal be? Shouldn't our goal be sustainable agriculture? Shouldn't we be doing whatever's best to produce food in the most sustainable manner? And if that means using genetic inputs that might be biotech and maybe production methods that might be organic, wouldn't that be the best thing? And we shouldn't necessarily have these very defined distinctions. So I raise it not for a plug. You don't have to go read this book, but it gives you a food for thought about different ways one can think about these issues, that we don't have to be necessarily so doctrinaire one way or the other. But in my opinion, the question is coexistence a big issue? To date, it hasn't been, in part because we're talking about generally different crops. When we talk about organic, we generally talk about fruits and vegetables. And when we're talking about genetic engineered crops, again, we're talking about commodity crops, corn, soybeans. There aren't that many acres of corn or soybeans that are organic in the United States. There are farmers. People are sometimes surprised when I say this. There are farmers that use more than one production method. So there are farmers in California who grow genetically engineered corn on part of their farm, and next to it they might grow organic tomatoes. So they do both. I think people think, oh, you're either an organic farmer or you're a conventional farmer. That's just not always the case, and maybe everybody here knows that. This is a farming state, but there are a lot of people in Washington, at least, who don't necessarily know that. And in fact, most neighbors get along. They use separation distances. They know about the different crops. Coexistence is not unique to biotech. People will know that there are certain markets for blue corn. And if you are selling into the blue corn market, you don't want to have white or yellow kernels. And you want to make sure that if you have a certain number of white or yellow kernels on each cob, your corn's going to get rejected, and you're getting a premium for growing blue corn. And so people have worked those things out. That's a coexistence issue. The difference here, again, with biotech is you can't see it. With blue corn, you can see if there's white or yellow kernels. You can't see that necessarily with biotech. So is this as big a problem as people have portrayed? Not necessarily, although it could become a bigger problem as we get more crops that are genetically engineered. Is it being adequately addressed by individuals, by market forces? Not necessarily. We do hear stories of people who do take economic losses because their crop has unintended presence of genetically engineered kernels or things in it. Is there government regulation, or should we just rely on industry stewardship? And if there is a loss by somebody, do we have a compensation mechanism? That advisory committee for Secretary Vilsack that I'm on, that's what we've been charged with doing. It's a committee of 23 stakeholders from the full range. There are about 8 different farmers on it. There's a number of people from the organic industry. I'm on it. There are people from with an international perspective. But the big issue is what should the government get involved in a compensation mechanism in case someone has an economic loss due to the unintended presence of genetically engineered material in their crop. So moving forward, my take on coexistence is that the government does need to establish some overarching policies in this area. To date, they have none. And then they need to help implement them at the farm level. I think there's very little, I think there's a lot of documentation out there about what works well at the farm and county level for coexistence and other kinds of situations that could be used. And I think nobody's really documented the extent of the problem. So I've been calling on the government and academic scientists, people here at places like Iowa State, to really document what is the rate at which some crops don't get to the markets that they want to get to because of unintended presence. And I do think that coexistence needs to be separated from safety issues. There are a lot of countries that want to merge those two together. The U.S. so far doesn't do that, and I continue to advocate that. I think it's important that for consumers that we know whether something's safe. Then if there are economic or other impacts, we want to separate those. When you start mixing those up, I think consumers lose confidence and with the regulatory system because they don't know if something's being denied because it's unsafe or they're being denied because there's a trade implication or an economic implication. So I'd like to conclude. I hope you saw that fancy. That was my fanciest slide. I'm a lawyer, you know. I'm not super on the PowerPoint. But I don't think biotech is a silver bullet. And people who tell you that, I think they're not being genuine with you. It's not a panacea for world hunger or food insecurity. It's not going to solve every agricultural constraint faced by farmers in developed or developing countries. But I do think it can solve specific agricultural production issues for some farmers. And it can have some benefits to farmers, some benefits to the environment, and hopefully benefits to the consumers. And it can be applied safely. It's a technology where a lot of the applications are going to be safe, but maybe 1 in 100 might not be safe, and that's why I at least advocate for having regulation, oversight. It's still going to be controversial. This is an organization, Millions Against Monsanto. I don't know how many people they have, but it's still going to be controversial. There's no question about it. My view of the future is that the dominoes are beginning to fall, that crops are being grown in North and South America. They're being grown in China and India. They're going to move to Southeast Asia and Africa. Europe is going to be the outlier. They are very much against this technology, and the consumers are, and their farmers are growing them in very small numbers. And I think they may lose this technology. What are the next engineered crops? I do think that GE rice and BT eggplant are on the horizon, both in China and India. And as I said, I think they are going to be game changers because they will be the first major crops for human consumption when they come out. Here in the United States, I know the wheat growers and the potato growers are interested in this, but they're very timid about it because they are concerned about their markets. I know I've been invited in the last 2 years to speak at each of those industries' major conferences, so they're beginning to talk about it among their stakeholders, and companies are beginning and scientists are beginning to research them, but I think they may come, but not too quickly. There's a plum that's been genetically engineered, virus resistant to the plum pox virus. It's been approved. It's ready to go. It was done by public researchers at USDA, but they don't have a method, a route to commercialization yet. So that could be coming. And things like bananas. These bananas are something in a country like Uganda. This is not the right. I didn't have a picture of the Ugandan banana. This is the banana we would eat. But I do think we will see some crops and different kinds of crops in some developing countries. So what are my take-home messages? I would say that biotech crops are here to stay. I would say that the current crops in the U.S. are safe and that they provide some benefits. As I said earlier, I think everything's got to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. You really have to individually look at the particular crop, the particular environment for both the benefits and the potential risks. And so, I challenge all of you when you see articles about this topic, when you talk to people about it, when you read something on the internet, to ask questions, require specific facts, make people dig down deep, because again, there's a lot of people say a lot of things, but what's behind it? I do think regulation is necessary, and I think that there are some major improvements that are needed in the U.S. regulatory system. I think the next generation has some big potential, maybe some nutritionally enhanced crops, but also some more controversial things like the genetically engineered animals. I think education in this area is essential. When I talk to people about this, I think, this audience, Iowa is the heartland, it's the farmland. I grew up in New Jersey. A lot of people in New Jersey and Washington don't know where their food comes from. They don't know what's going on in the farm. And that's even in New Jersey, which we call ourselves the Garden State. And so I think there's education needed not just about genetic engineering, but about our food and where our food comes from. That's where it starts. And as I would end, I would say it's complicated. As I mentioned, there's some benefits here, there's some potential risks. This is an invisible technology to the naked eye, and it does complicate things. It complicates things on the farm, it complicates things in the store, and so forth. So, as I mentioned, we have a website. There's frequently asked questions on there that I just recently updated. I have all the articles that I've written. They're all free to download. There's comments that we've done to the agencies. And there's my email address. I always welcome questions, both now but also after I leave. If you ever have a question, feel free to email me. I'll try to answer them the best I can or point you in the right direction to information. So at this point, I'd love to open it up and ask for questions and comments.
I'm Dale Bloom. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm wondering, has there ever been a non-reversible problem caused by GE for anywhere in the world that is a horrible problem that people are so worried about? I don't know. I just wondered.
So I'm not aware of any non-reversible problem, but I didn't talk today. There is, in fact, Iowa State University, there's some scientists here who published a paper a few months ago about the first field resistant insects that they developed in the field here in some fields in Iowa. So if that continues, that would potentially be a non-reversible impact. Similarly, the National Research Council came out with a study last year that showed 22 weed species that are now resistant to the herbicide, Roundup herbicide, glyphosate. So I don't see those weed species changing it. We're forced to use other solutions. That's more prevalent again in the South, less of a problem here in a place like Iowa. But it is, I think they say 7 to 10 million acres of cropland that is having difficulty using glyphosate. Now, some of us might say, well, that's not really a harm. We just go to some other industry says, let's use a cocktail of other herbicides. But glyphosate is on the scale, it's relatively benign, it's cheap, it's easy to use. If we're going to use an herbicide, it's probably the best one to use. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there are impacts that happen just generally in agriculture that you wouldn't have reversible. These things might happen with chemicals, but we do see them happening with the biotech crops.
You seem to dismiss the European concerns without much comment. Have they no valid points?
They don't. So the European food safety agencies and pretty much all the scientific societies around the world have said that these crops are safe to eat, the ones that are currently grown. They've looked at that data. A lot of Europeans think they're not safe. So to that extent, yes, I've sort of discounted that. They primarily have rejected these because their consumers don't want them. They don't like the multinational corporations. They don't like the trade things. They don't like what it does to their food, that they think it's not natural. There's a host of reasons why they are against these. And part of it is these were introduced at a time when mad cow disease and a number of food scares occurred, and the Europeans were lied to by their government officials. And so they have a different perspective coming into it. So they have their opinion. It's their opinion. I don't think behind it, there aren't necessarily a lot of scientific facts that I think raise questions for the current crops, but they do have concerns.
In the pharmaceutical industry, there are issues of orphaned drugs, right? So there are many people who did lots of research on Viagra, but there are very few people doing research on, diseases that poor people die of, like malaria and cholera. It seems to me that there are issues in biotech also involving orphaned crops. So there's a huge amount of research going on at Iowa State on corn, but there's relatively little research going on developing biotech cassava, for example. There is some, but I think it's focused mostly on virus resistance and less on nutritional aspects or other aspects of these crops. And they're poor people's crops. They're crops development of which is less likely to make an inventor or a biotechnologist rich. But in another sense, they're very crucial crops. So I wonder if you could say something about work that's being done in biotechnology on crops that may be orphaned in that way.
You raise a good point. I mean, that's right. This technology started in the U.S. and it was started by big multinational seed and pesticide companies, and they looked at their markets and they said, well, we sell, lots and lots of corn seed. So if we can genetically engineer it, we can make lots and lots of money. And we don't sell lots of lettuce seed, or we don't, deal with some of the fruits and vegetables in the U.S., and we clearly don't have a market for cassava or cowpea or some of these other things. So those things have been neglected for a long time. I think the Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation and some of these groups are now, and governments didn't support it. The U.S. government did, but a lot of the European governments and other aid donors didn't support it because it was very controversial. Now you are seeing Gates and some other putting in a fair amount of money, and you're seeing more of these public-private partnerships in places like Africa to do that. So they're late to the table, but there's nothing that says that this technology won't prove beneficial to some of those farmers for some of the constraints that they have in their farming systems. But you're right, we don't have it to date, and it's a shame. But it's a product of the fact that of the way this is developed. One of the things we worry about in the U.S. and all these countries is that we don't make our regulatory hurdles so high that we can't develop some of those, that the expense of going through the regulatory system or the hurdles that they're being put through aren't so expensive because private companies are in it for the long run. Public researchers at places like Iowa State, they do a lot of great research, but their job necessarily isn't to make a commercial product, and how do you get it to a commercial stage is another issue.
I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on one of the risks you mentioned, allergenicity. My wife's a high school teacher. She's got 180 students a day. 3 of them have nut allergies, and part of her duties is to police to make sure no nuts get into the room, or to know what to do if even a food item wrapper that had been around nuts shows up in the room. She has one that is so extremely allergic that it would create a reaction. My question for you is, do all of the scientists and companies out there that have these gene guns, do they have enough self-restraint to not mess with things that we know have lethal allergic reactions? And a second question is, if we have something that triggers a whole new kind of allergic reaction, how would we know that it was happening unless it was lethal?
So the question about allergenicity, I can give you several examples that one can say either show the regulatory system works or also shows that maybe why we need a regulatory system. So there is an example that's in the literature that says that there was a soybean that was genetically engineered with a gene from a Brazil nut, and when they did some of the allergenicity testing, it did suggest that it might be an allergen, and so it was not commercialized. So the company voluntarily did not move forward with that. So you could say, well, that's self-restraint that they went and did that. Another example is the Starling corn example. In 2001, EPA mistakenly, in hindsight, approved Starling corn. There, the data from the allergenicity testing wasn't conclusive that it wasn't an allergen, and they said, therefore, you only can use it for animal feed. You can't use it in the human food supply. That their mistake was this quote unquote this split approval, because in the end, EPA, which isn't used to regulating agricultural products, didn't realize that there's no way you're going to keep corn only in the feed supply and not get some of it into the food supply. And it eventually got in the food supply, and they had to recall all of that. It cost $1 billion. There were about 25 people who thought they had had allergic reactions to it. The CDC did take serum from those people and do tests and didn't find any of them allergic to this protein that was in the Starling corn. So there are a number of tests. In America, we've decided humans aren't guinea pigs. We don't test our food on guinea pigs, so we don't, give it to people and see if they get an allergic reaction. We don't feed them this protein or the corn with the protein in it. We do tests, digestibility tests. We do other tests that simulate allergenicity. And we don't have a good animal model. For some kinds of things, we have better animal models than none. We don't have an animal model yet, a really good animal model for allergenicity. So we do the tests we do, and the scientists, those are the international communities come together, what they think are the best tests. And if any of those red flags show up, then they test serum of potentially allergic individuals to see what would react. And if there's not a clean bill of health, if there's any question, it doesn't get through the regulatory process. So there are checks and balances on that. I think that the companies and others are fairly sensitive to this, given the way the population has been these days and how we've all been sensitized to allergens. It is the best that they are doing the state of the science, but the science is not. I mean, it's good, but it could be better if we had additional testing and things like that.
I'm not an overly religious person, so I don't like pumping on the Bible much. But I've been looking at this kind of since it started. Fairly recently it was really popularized. And I see that these scientists are looking upon this food, and they seem to think they can improve on what God made. And sometimes it makes it look like God made a mistake, and they're here to correct God's blunders, like they made the avocado pit too big or something. And they're messing with God's plan. That's kind of my conclusion. They're messing with it. And the reason we can tell this is because the more they genetically adulterate his food, the worse problems we get with diseases and all kinds of other malevolent circumstances. And I think what they're doing here seems obvious to me is they've got like patents on these things. And they've taken this food. First they've created something new under the sun. And then they're patenting it. And they're making us buy it. And if we don't want to buy it, then we just don't eat. Because the only places they have left for the original wheat germ and all that stuff is in universities that are agriculture based, and those are hidden away. All we can get is this genetically modified seed from the farmers that's all they can buy. And if they don't want to buy that, then they just don't get it. So ultimately they're using food not only as a profit, but also as a weapon and as a means of extortion. You'll do what we say or you just don't eat. And this is contrary to what our God had planned. He gave us a standalone food supply. If you had a few acres, you had your corn and your wheat and your fruits and vegetables and your things like that, and each one reproduced naturally. Well, these people don't want it to have natural. They want us to come to the corporations rather than to the exact food that we got it from, take the seeds out and plant it again. Heirloom seeds are becoming almost outlawed. And I think this is boiling down to a battle between what I call ultimate evil versus ultimate good. And that's what it is.
I agree with you that I think it's very important that we have seed supplies available to farmers who want to grow a host of different crops for a host of different markets. And I am very strong advocate for making sure that we don't have that farmers who want to grow non-genetic engineered seeds and want to grow organic seeds can have those, and that we shouldn't have monopolies to such an extent that farmers have no choice but to buy biotech seeds, and that they have to buy ones that have genes and expensive things that they don't even need for the pests or other things that they have. So I agree with you there. I am not a scientist. If I was a geneticist or a plant biologist, I would put, and I know a lot of them, they would put up a lot of slides that would show you that the progenitor of corn was teosinte, and it doesn't look at all like corn. The stalk was maybe this big, and it had a few tiny little kernels in it. And what we have today is a cob is this big, and it has these big kernels. And that wasn't from genetic engineering. It's been humans. Each year, centuries ago, a farmer would grow a crop, and he would pick the best plant out there that had the best genetics, and he would save those seeds. And then he would share them with somebody else, and somebody else would share them. And eventually they would. And the ones that came 10 generations didn't look like the ones that were 10 generations before that. And then we did things like irradiation, like I mentioned before, or we did other kinds of chemical mutagenesis. We've done so. I raised that just to say that I agree these crops aren't the way they were put originally on the earth, but they've been changed for centuries before biotech and genetic engineering got into changing them. And so if we got rid of genetic engineering, these crops, corn, tomatoes, potatoes, do not at all look like their ancestors, their ancestors did, because humans have manipulated them for their own benefit to have varieties that were resistant to things. But I do agree that we have to worry about monoculture. We have to worry about the fact that if in an agricultural system with a few different seed companies and varieties and things like that, we can worry that a disease or something could have large impact. So I agree with you on some of the points, but I do think humans have been doing this for a lot longer than just genetic engineering.
Two issues kind of stand out for me among a number of them that genetic engineering really doesn't address. Approximately 6,000 calories if you just take grains that are produced in the world, you'll have 6,000 calories for every man, woman, and child on the face of the earth. That's a lot more than any person needs individually. The most active person at their prime of their life don't need 6,000 calories. And that doesn't include fruits, vegetables, nuts, fish, grass-raised meat, and wildlife that are harvested for food for people. So there's plenty of calories in the world. Genetic engineering won't, and the problem is that it's a distribution problem. The developed world has all the food they need. They have more than they need. The undeveloped world has a lack of it. So it's a money and distribution problem that people aren't getting the food they need. And people who advocate for genetic engineering say that we have to produce more food. Well, we have enough food, more than enough. And if you took all the grains out of human consumption and put it into animal foods, you'd still have enough calories just in grains to more than meet the needs of the people. So I'd like to know why we continue to push this genetic engineering for food production when it's not the solution to the problem. And another issue is that one of the reasons why we need BT corn in a state like Iowa is because we have acres and acres and acres of corn and virtually nothing else, some soybeans. And now we're going to more and more acres of corn on corn on corn. And the reason we need BT is because of the fact we have such a monoculture that we have these pests that invade the corn. If we had multiple crop rotations, if we had prairie plantings, if we had a diverse system of agriculture, instead of trying to produce this industrial model onto the world, we wouldn't need genetically engineered crops like we are seeing push down the farmers' input system.
So if my boss was here today, I think he'd say something that's fairly controversial in the state of Iowa, so maybe I'll say it. Anyway, he'd say that, he wouldn't disagree that we have a lot of calories and we have all the foods we need. One of the reasons we're growing all that is because people eat too much meat. And if we, it takes so much grain, it's very inefficient to feed all the grain to a cow and then eat the meat. And if we all got rid of meat every Monday, we could take 15% of the land in the Midwest and put it back to prairie land, and maybe that would be the whole state of Iowa or something like that. So somewhat controversial, but I don't disagree with you. We have plenty of calories. We're growing plenty of stuff, but we're growing a lot of it in part because of the diets that we choose to eat as Americans and as other people. China, as these countries develop, people want more meat. They move from vegetarian diets to more meat diets, and that requires more production. So that's one comment I make. The other one I just say is that I don't disagree with you. And I don't think anybody says that genetic engineered crops are the key to food security. Clearly, it's poverty, and there is a distribution thing. But the view today is that the solution to that is to let local small-scale farmers produce more of their own food, not for us to ship our food to them in different ways. And since this is a scale-neutral technology, it may help some of those farmers move from being subsistence farmers to being productive farmers on lands that are somewhat marginal in places like Africa. So I don't think anybody's pushing genetic engineering as the solution to all those things. But you have to, one of the things about agriculture, one, it's as an extreme environmental footprint on the earth. I mean, it's one of the most detrimental things that humans have ever done on the earth is agriculture generally. But you can't look at it in a vacuum. You have to look at, what's our current agriculture footprint? And does biotech improve that a little bit? If we reduce pesticide use or we increase yields on the same land, relatively speaking, it may still have some benefit, even though I agree with you. If we got rid of poverty is the real problem for a lot of people who don't have enough food.
You talked a lot about your science and the regulatory system and making sure everything's safe, but how have GE crops altered small towns? I don't know, I'm not sure, you haven't really, or you're not from Iowa, so if you've seen how small towns have changed and how the commodification of GE crops and how farmers, are cutting out ditch rows to get those 2-3 more rows of corn, how is the commodification and just changes, have you any experience with seeing small towns? I know you look at the science behind the health of it, but I'm saying the economics of it and just how it changes small town and how farming has changed over the years and how they don't grow any food. You don't see farmers having big gardens anymore. You see all corn or you see all soybeans. And he was saying, the diversification, when you just industrialize a crop, your biodiversity, how does that promote biodiversity? You're creating, a monoculture. And how has monoculture affected the economics of small town Iowa, of small town farming communities in the U.S.? I'm not trying to focus on your, African farmers who grow for subsistence. We commodified corn. How has it changed, small town Iowa?
One of the things, I haven't seen data specifically about corn. There clearly is data that shows that, for example, we're growing more corn and soybeans and less wheat in the United States because farmers like the convenience of the genetic engineered crops and they want to grow those as opposed to wheat, which is more difficult to grow because they have to worry about weeds and other things. So there clearly has been a replacement of some crops by other crops. I don't think that's so much fruits and vegetables going to corn, but that may be the case. But I've heard about it in things like wheat, for example, and some of the other commodity crops. But the fact that those are commodity crops, I think they were commodity crops well before there were genetic engineering. And I don't think, proportionally, most of what was grown in Iowa was still corn and soybeans 15 years ago. There may be more of it now, total acres, but I'm not sure there's that much less fruits or vegetables or other things that's been the displacement. So I think you're talking about trends that have clearly occurred, but I think they would occur independent of whether they're biotech or not. We're not using corn for ethanol because the corn happens to be genetically engineered. We're using corn for ethanol because of oil prices and a host of other things, and that's why people are growing more corn. So I agree with you that there have been some studies on some displacement. I think of what the problems in rural America, biotech may have an incremental impact, but most of the impact has been other factors.
Let's take one more last question, and then we have some
my question is, I'm just wondering how we can still be so sure. It sounds like we're basing a lot of the safety that the genetically modified food from the FDA statement of 1992 that said genetically modified foods are generally seen as safe. That's the ruling that everything goes back to, right? That's why we're not labeling genetically modified food as opposed to food that doesn't have genetically modified items in it, because the FDA said in 1992 that it's generally seen as safe. Is that correct?
So I may have misspoken or maybe not made myself particularly clear. So FDA came out with a policy to say a general policy statement in 1992, but then they have this voluntary consultation process, and each of the genetic engineered crops that's been commercialized has gone through it, where they have specific allergenicity testing, specific toxicity testing, specific testing on those specific crops, on those specific varieties, to make sure that there's not a food safety risk. It's not mandatory. I asked for it to be mandatory, but we have, as well as other independent scientists, looked at that data, and nobody has any evidence or suggested in any way that those aren't safe. So
what about I understand that they're finding BT in the human gut now. So that's not supposed to be there. So how can we say that it's safe to have food that is producing BT? You said it expresses itself in the leaf, the corn with BT, but they're finding now that it's in the root system. It's much more in the dirt around the roots than they ever thought it was going to be. So how can this be safe, and why are we not at least saying the food has genetically modified organisms in it or not? I'd like to be able to choose.
Right. So FDA has made a decision that they aren't requiring labeling of these foods. There's no mandatory labeling. People can voluntarily label if their food is genetically engineered or it doesn't have genetic engineering. And there's a whole legal and policy reason behind that. I don't think they're going to change that. Our view is that, if there's any question about its safety, we shouldn't allow it into the food supply. We don't think labeling should be a surrogate for safety. So if there's any question about its safety, we shouldn't put it in the food supply. The idea of putting it in the food supply because we question whether it's safe or not and letting individuals choose, we don't think that's the proper way to do as a scientific matter. We don't think that should be. But consumers should be able to find out from companies in a voluntarily way or additional way whether or not their food is genetic engineered or not if they want to. So I don't know if I've answered your question or not, but...
What about finding BT in the gut now, the human gut?
Well, I gather I'm not aware of them finding it in the... in the digestive system you would expect... although the BTs are primarily depending on the BT, for corn, for example, some of it's primarily meant to be expressed in the leaf. There is going to be some in the corn kernels, or it may be meant to be in the root. Some of it may be in the corn kernels. So it wouldn't be surprising that, again, as we digest things, the proteins get digested in our body. They get broken down, pieces of the DNA from the BT part of that gene. Wouldn't be surprised if we'd find it through the digestive system, as we'd find lots of other things that we put in our digestive system.
But I'm not so sure that it's breaking down. That's from my understanding, it wasn't breaking down. It was being found in the gut, that it was there. It was established.
I'm not aware of that study.
Well, tomorrow you are invited to come to Seed Center at 11:30. You have an interest and time. Greg is going to speak on the similar topic but in a different context. And we will start pizza. I don't know whether it's cheese and pizza. But it's going to be safe and delicious. So with that, join me with the round of applause. Back there, and you can take me to one day and
Hi.
Oh. Quick policy question. You mentioned there's 29 countries that accept GMOs.
That are growing them, yeah.
And your sense is that the United States regulatory system is not sufficient. In your opinion, do any of the 29 countries have a regulatory system that is sufficient? And what would it be?
I mean, I think they all have. If I was defining the ideal system, I would probably take pieces of different regulatory systems. So, I don't. I mean, I think some of the other countries have some better legal requirements than ours have, because ours was. I didn't mention it, but I mean, pretty much we took old laws and adapted it to a new technology. And when you take old laws and you adapt to new technology, you have sort of square pegs going into round holes. They don't fit very well, and so there are overlaps and gaps, and we sort of make up for those. So nobody said, FDA, food isn't that important, so we're not going to make it mandatory. It's because of the law we have doesn't allow it to be made mandatory, kind of thing. So I like the fact that European Union or other countries have mandatory food safety things, but some of those countries have a lot of other things in their systems. They're not as transparent or participatory as ours. So I guess of the ones I've studied, I haven't found the perfect one yet. I would take parts of different ones. I don't think ours is, I think ours on the technical side is pretty good, and on the transparency side is pretty good. But we have some gaps that I think potentially will let some things fall through the cracks, and that bothers me. Other ones are clearly more encompassing, but aren't anywhere near as efficient, for example. So I can't point to one and say that's ideal.
Well, I was so curious if there was one that we could just advocate adopting that country's policy.
Yeah.
I appreciate your answer. Thank you.
I'm going to move over here just behind the